Well, it's time now for an SABC News exclusive. Now, with just over 3 weeks left in her tenure as head of UN Women in New York, the country's first and only female deputy president is preparing to return home. In her first exit interview after 8 years at UN Women, she sits down in live conversation with the SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who's standing by at the UN headquarters in New York. Sherwin, over to you.
Peter and Doro, thank you very much indeed. And if UN Women was the aircraft and the executive director, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, was its pilot, I think it's fair to say that we have begun our descent. You correctly point out, Peter, she has about 25 days left in this high office here at the United Nations before returning to South Africa. She joins us now for this exclusive discussion. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, the outgoing executive director of UN Women and Under Secretary General at the United Nations. Welcome back to SABC News. It's good to see you.
Thank you and good evening.
We were here when you took the oath of office on August 19th, 2013. Your last day in this role will be August 17th, 2021. There have been some highs. There have been many disappointments in achieving this sweeping agenda that is located within Goal 5 of the SDGs. Where do you think your 8 years in this role has left us on the issue of women's empowerment and equality?
Well, thank you for the interview. We certainly took off to the extent that we can, with still a lot of work to do. The United Nations is an organization of member states. They really believe and are embedded in law. So we changed a lot of laws in order to make sure that the women of the world live in countries where their rights are recognized and realized. But not everywhere do women get to live their full rights. So just between 2018 to this year, we changed 700 laws, just to give you a sense, and we still have a long way to go. So I would like the momentum to stay on and to move on. We helped countries to change 35 constitutions that discriminated. And we also made sure that while we are changing the laws, we are changing the norms. Because, you know, you can change the law, but the norms, if they don't change, you don't actually feel and see the change. And one of the ways in which we have changed laws, we've worked with the extremes, the traditional leaders. In Africa, we ended up forming an all-African traditional leaders organization, which is very strong. They are making bylaws in their communities to end child marriage, to end FGM, to end, not to end because that's difficult, but violence against women, and to force parents to keep children at school. And we have worked with private sector on the other end, formed an unstereotype alliance of all the marketers and advertisers in the world. Every top respectable advertising company is part of this alliance. And what they are doing is not to use stereotype adverts.
And it all kind of came together in what could be seen as your swan song at the United Nations, which is the Generation Equality Forum in Paris at the beginning of July. The 25-year anniversary, of course, of the blueprint, that was our blueprint for 25 years, the Beijing Platform of Action, delayed, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic for 1 year. The Generation Equality Forum saw $40 billion in new investments with a bold action plan to accelerate gender equality towards 2026. Does this mean, Executive Director, that you have now the wind at your back, or are we facing headwinds that have been intensified, no less by the COVID-19 pandemic? Where are we on the agenda?
You know, it just came together at that moment. It was supposed to have been in 2020, but we had it in 2021. But the critical things that we tried to do in generation equality was to extend the support for gender equality, because it has just been governments and civil society. That's such a narrow base.
Yeah, you talked about a new multilateralism, right?
New multilateralism, where you bring in everybody, where you bring in young people in particular to be a strong force in that alliance. We wanted to increase investment into the women's agenda, which is how, when I came, I had budget of about $250 million, and now we have been able to get support that is 40 billion, which doesn't come to us necessarily. It goes to member states, it goes to civil society and other actors, and it was important to accelerate the pace of change because change was too slow, and bringing these together, bringing them with the money and their commitment has been good for us.
That's my point, right? Change takes money. Women's empowerment and equality requires resources, and that was the point.
You need more people. That has been really important. Men, for instance, when I came at UN Women, were not an ally or a partner. In fact, let me not say an ally, because you are an ally because you're helping. It is their duty. They were not activists in the space to the extent that we wanted them to be. The males organizations that were there needed to be supported. And we opened that as a space. We engaged with member states, and now almost in every country we actually have men that are taking up the space. We want men who are powerful, men who have authority, men who are rich, just as much as we want ordinary men and boys in society.
What can you say about the institution that is the United Nations? You have now had a seat at the highest table, but as you mentioned, the core power base within the United Nations system lies with its member states, right? The role of women in our society is you don't necessarily get agreement on that among member states, whether you're talking about climate change and its urgency, or how to end conflicts, or how to fortify the development agenda. Talk about this institution that you have been a part of at the highest echelons for the last 8 years.
It is a wonderful institution that I've learned to understand and to love.
On paper.
But it is a difficult institution to work with. The fact that we have the Commission on the Status of Women, which meets every year, you would assume to raise the status of women. But sometimes when you listen to the deliberations, it's like there's just a core group of countries who just want to maintain the status quo or to bring it down. So it is always a fight to take it from where it is in some areas forward. The fact that, as you probably know, we always talk about agreed language. I mean, what is agreed language? Agreed language means that we are not moving from where you have been, and trying to break away from this context of agreed language.
Yeah, a consensus-driven approach, right?
Absolutely. And if one country dissents, the whole thing collapses. So it's been managing a very delicate way for all of us in order to do all the things that we've done. It's obviously more complicated at the Security Council, but at the General Assembly just itself has been a big change. But I'm glad that in my 8 years, there's never been a year where I did not get the agreed conclusions at the end of civil society. But I tell you, every year is such a fight.
Yeah. You mentioned the Security Council. I wonder if you have any insight into the reform process that really has limped over the last 25 years to any real sort of conclusion. In fact, a lot of UN officials say, you know, this is just going to be a pipe dream in terms of pushing this reform agenda. Do you see it happening in our lifetimes?
Certainly it had to happen in our lifetime. For us, the Security Council has been important for our work on women, peace and security. And we have moved it. The crimes against women that are committed in times of war were not always recognized as real crimes. Now you definitely, as you know, you see women coming to brief, you see those crimes being recognized, and the Security Council has been critical to that. But you also see almost a laid-back institution that does not have a sense of urgency that you need about the decisions that we desperately need. We are calling for the Security Council to call for disinvestment in the support of weapons, because that costs much more than the support you need for peace. To support some communities who end up fighting because of water, bringing them water is much less expensive than having to buy weapons, which lead up to a much greater situation. So the reform agenda is both about gender, by the way, because the reform has to make sure that the Security Council is also gender responsive in its work.
Let's shift our focus away from the United Nations to your home country, South Africa. We are having this conversation, Executive Director, during what many have called the darkest time in post-apartheid South Africa. I guess we can literally talk about Eskom's inability to keep the lights on, COVID-19 pandemic, what many argue has been a fumbled response to it. The State Capture Commission is ongoing. A former president has been incarcerated for defying the Constitutional Court. A government that claims it withstood an insurrection. More than 330 dead as a result of unrest, riots, looting and destruction that will run into billions of rands. What do you make of this moment facing South Africa today?
Yeah, definitely the saddest moment. And for it to happen around the time when we were preparing to celebrate Madiba, made it even more saddening. I mean, it was not totally unexpected that when the former deputy president goes to prison, some people may react, but not at this scale. Certainly, it was orchestrated. You could see that we did not respond as adequately as we could have.
So you agree with this notion that it was an insurrection?
Yeah, well, I agree. Definitely, I agree that it was an insurrection. There's almost like a story of two countries, South Africa and America, where you have these almost similar things happening to the countries in times like this. But I'm also very proud of the communities and the people who said hell no, who were able to stop it from spreading throughout the country, who made announcements very loud about how much they disagreed. I was actually impressed to see that our taxi industry also stood up in some of the communities and refused to be party to this.
Some say the damage was done already.
But it was a dark hour for us. Certainly it's a dark hour, and in the midst of a pandemic.
Many people on the international stage, in particular, have lauded former President Zuma's incarceration as a victory for the rule of law. But its aftermath also showed the world the face of black poverty, which arguably remains the biggest challenge that the post-1994 administrations have faced. Whose failure is that?
Well, all of us, we have failed when we have people who are so desperately hungry that they would be put in that situation. Because indeed, a lot of the people who were part of those demonstrations, which then became so big, were people who are unemployed, who are hungry, who just saw an opportunity for them to get something that they needed. I saw a 7-year-old boy running away with pajamas and saying, "This is my first pair of pajamas." Who could fault that child for an act like that? So there's definite, COVID was one space for us to reflect about the inequalities in the world and in our country. And this activity was for specifically South Africa, a moment for us to recognize how much poverty we have in our country and how we all are supposed to go. Probably for me, this just said to me, even if I would have wanted to do something else somewhere else in the world, this is not the time. This is the time to be in South Africa. So I'm glad that I'm able to go back home now and find something to do.
We'll talk about what you're going to find to do when you go back, but let me just push you on this notion that it's all about failure. When you say it's all of us, who are you referring to? Every South African, or members of the African National Congress governments that have led since 1994?
The ruling party, the government, us, the people who are in institutions or in a class where you are able to do more. Our organizations, this is a collective a job. You cannot only expect one institution to get it right.
And as you and I both know from just the data in covering the work at UN Women in particular, when you see riots and conflict of this nature, it's the women and the children that bear the brunt in the long term.
Always.
Is this not?
Always.
This must be a particular concern to you.
Absolutely. And then it is also women who would usually stand up to try and find solutions. In this situation in South Africa, our first point of call from here, my point of call was the women in South Africa who are in the Gertrude Shope Institution in Foreign Affairs, who are the women in Women, Peace and Security. They are the ones that are collecting mediators and helping to send women in different communities to go and help a dialogue to begin in the community. So women are sufferers, women are also solution makers. In COVID, women were the majority of those who cared for us. We could never have gone through this without women. But in terms of how we are responding to COVID, it is women who are getting less of what is available to address what they have lost. 2/3 of the jobs that were lost during COVID were lost by women. And it is mostly women who are in jobs that are in the informal sector, no insurance, no savings, and therefore in difficult situations. And of course, the rate of gender-based violence also increased. So that too put women in a particular situation.
I want to take you back to the 52nd National Conference of the African National Congress in Polokwane in 2007, where you were part of the Mbeki slate, running against a Zuma slate, losing handily in the end, one might say. You were put forward for the position of Treasurer General of the party while being the first and only female deputy president of the country at the time. How do you recall that moment in Polokwane when you lost?
I actually had internalized it before because I could see it coming. Maybe if they had me, they would not have had so much money lost anyway. So I sort of accepted it at that point, but a disappointment nevertheless. And for me, it was not going to be appropriate to go into a slate if we were not going with as many of the people that I was in a slate with.
So let me just challenge you on that. You're saying if you were successful in becoming Treasurer General, the African National Congress might not have lost as much money as it has since.
Well, I hope so. I don't think I would have stolen.
Former President Mbeki was recalled.
Yes.
You were second in line to the presidency. And some argue you might have made history had you stayed in your position and not resigned after his announcement that he would be leaving his job. Why did you step down?
Well, I thought about that too. But I thought that the relationship was so much broken.
The relationship between whom?
Between the group that won and those of us who were in positions that lost, that staying there would have just been a matter of time before they chucked me out. And I really did not want to complicate the situation. I also felt strongly that what happened to President Mbeki was unfair. So I sort of felt that my heart was there with him. There should be another way in which I could serve South Africa, but I was definitely saddened to leave my position at that time because I would have loved to serve more.
But such was your loyalty to former President Thabo Mbeki?
My loyalty to former president and my inability I still feel to work with the team as it was. I don't think that it would have been it hasn't been an enabling working environment.
So you feel you could not have worked with the Zuma administration, or certainly the top six that was elected on that slate?
Certainly, it's the time, yeah.
You recall that it was parts of the African National Congress and many officials at the time, executive director, that were aligned with former President Zuma, who were of the view that there was a political tampering in the corruption cases he faced. Your proximity to this, your husband being the former head of the National Prosecuting Authority at the time, you were the deputy president that replaced then Deputy President Jacob Zuma. How do you respond to criticism that seeks to use your proximity to these matters against you?
Well, I really don't pay attention to that. I mean, one thing I can tell you about governments, they're not very good at conspiracies. Government is not usually, not just in South Africa, everywhere, organized enough to pull a conspiracy. So
there's no truth to those claims?
So I don't even know enough about this, but I certainly do not give it any attention. And I really people give it, because there's so many conflicting and untrue stories in that narrative.
Let's talk a little bit about Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. She might have been the first female president had the Mbeki slate triumphed in 2007. She ran against incumbent Cyril Ramaphosa at Nasrec for the top job in 2017, coming close, but of course not good enough. Are there any similarities, you both being women at the higher echelons of the ANC at different periods, are there any similarities between your experience when you were in the executive and that of Dr. Dlamini-Zuma?
Well, I suppose the fact that we're both women is one important similarity, but also the fact that both of us contested and participated at a time when the organization itself was in conflict with itself. So you became a casualty in any case.
So guilty by association,
yeah,
is what you're saying?
And even the women that would otherwise normally support you in both our cases would not support us. I remember clearly in Polokwane a lady who stood up in my case, not necessarily directly to me, but I had made a point about the importance of making sure that the top 5 has adequate response of women. And this woman, who I know under normal circumstances would not argue like that, made an argument for pushing women out, because the women that were likely to make it were the women she did not like. Now, you know, so it was a particular moment, but in general, when you are a woman, you are likely to have to fight for anything and everything that you are going to have. And if you're contesting with a man, it is likely that, you know, things conspire against you, and that is what happened.
Some argue you could have dumped the Mbeki baggage.
Well, no, I didn't.
Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma might have dumped the Jacob Zuma baggage.
Well, I think probably for both me and Nkosazana, we were not there just for our convenience. You had an agenda in your mind, things that you wanted to do. You look at the package of people you're going to do it with, and you see, you know, you think, you know, this will be too difficult with this team. But I think, having said that, I have really moved away from the thoughts of Polokwane. Time has flown. I am now interested to work with any South African who wants to build the country. I think with hindsight, it's important to actually sometimes go and challenge the people you disagree with and try to make it work. At that time, it just looked too difficult.
I have a few questions about the future, and I'm getting there, I promise you. I want to deal, though, with this. There was a lot of reporting at the time, a lot of speculation about you leaving the African National Congress and joining COPE in 2009. You've never really spoken publicly, really, or on the record about this, so I put it to you. What happened in 2009? Did you join the Congress of the People Party?
You know, I sort of joined. and I attended the meetings. I think 1 or twice spoke at the meetings, but you know, my heart was always with the ANC. And within a short space of time, I think the feeling of where I really needed and wanted to be came back. And, you know, time helps to teach. And I began to reflect that, you know, if we all run away from this organization, who is going to build it? So yes, now I'm actively back in the ANC, and when I go back, I will be active with the ANC.
Which branch are you a member of?
The branch in Cape Town.
Okay, all right. So you are now officially a member of the African National Congress. I think we are certainly making news this evening, former Deputy President. Do you have...
But I mean, I'm also not making this a big deal, because I'm not asking for anything for me from the ANC. I'm just an ordinary member.
It's just a fact, and we like to deal with facts here. Do you have a political future in South Africa? One of your mantras during your 8 years here in New York has been the importance of women's leadership in politics or otherwise. So I put it to you, do you have enough of the constituency back home to consider possibly being a future president of South Africa?
Well, I certainly don't know. I haven't tested that. And this is not something I would want to ever rush into. I think there's just so many things that I can still do without getting into full politics. And I'm actually quite old also. So it's important to also create the space for younger people. I think if they have to recycle me, that means that we are not in a good situation. So I do want to encourage more younger people to get into politics, but I want to be there behind them to support them so that they can take the space.
Hillary Clinton was in her late 60s when she was running for the highest office here. Joe Biden was elected as the oldest president of the United States. Donald Trump is in his mid-70s. So it's interesting that a woman would say, you know, I'm too old for this.
But, you know, are there some things we regret from that? Yes, I mean, they brought a lot of experience and insight, but I think there's also limitations that come with age. And if we do not actively push for young people, for the space for young people, we'll never grow forward. I also don't say there is no space for older people. I think there's space to the extent that maybe a lot of older people don't want to move out. I'm just one of those who are volunteering.
Right.
That I don't want to take that space unnecessarily and crowd it, but I do want to work alongside the younger people.
The ANC, of course, goes to conference next year. Some of this will probably be a food fight if the factionalism we are seeing playing itself out is to be believed. For, of course, the leadership, the top six. Does the status quo suffice? I know you have a close relationship with the incumbent, or is it time for this push to be renewed for a woman to take over?
Well, of course, the will of the people is the will of the people. We'll always accept what the will of the people is. I have not seen or heard a woman who's wanting to stand up. Obviously, I will be highly conflicted if there's a woman.
That's a tough spot.
That would be a tough spot if there is a woman. But I think that the president does deserve a lot of support to go as far as he can. And
does he? A lot of people criticize the incumbent's leadership, particularly over the current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic facing the country. Does President Ramaphosa actually deserve the support you say he does?
Well, you know, there were mistakes that were made, and since I see what's happening all around the world, we are not different from any other country. I would have liked for us to be in a much better place as a country, that's for sure, the acquisition of vaccines and so on. But he also did a lot, not just for South Africa, but for the continent. So, you know, it is that record that has to be seen in its totality.
Final question, maybe one or two more. There is much talk back home about a possible imminent cabinet reshuffle. I wonder if you've had any calls from the West Wing of the Union buildings.
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. And then I don't think there's even a space for me there. As I'm saying, I really want to be part of whatever we are doing to address the damage, but I'm not necessarily looking for a political position.
So I'll give you the final word here. So not particularly a political position, not really sure what. Where do your interests lie? Where do your expertise lie moving forward, particularly in the South African context?
You know, I'm very much concerned about education. I also believe that the continued struggle for gender equality needs education, because education for me is still the closest thing to a silver bullet to gender equality. So I do want to dedicate quite a bit of my time in education alongside other activists who are in education. I have my foundation, Mlambo Foundation, so it gives me a base to work from on issues to do with education.
Still positive about South Africa's future?
Absolutely positive. We have to be. We have to be.
Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, thank you very much indeed for always making time for SABC News, and we wish you well in your future endeavors. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Sherwin. It's been beautiful to work with you. I also wish you good luck.
Thank you, ma'am. The former Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa and the outgoing Executive Director of UNWOMEN, and of course holding the title of Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. We thank her for always making time for the SABC News, and certainly Peter Ndoro, a lot to talk about tonight, and certainly making some news, I think some on-the-record discussions that we haven't enjoyed with the former Deputy President before making news here on the Globe tonight. It's back to you in Johannesburg.